Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Happy New Year's to all. Today we are going to be covering decks for the upcoming standard metagame challenge this upcoming weekend on MTG Arena. So this will be a standard best of 3 breakdown in terms of the best tier list or best decks in a tier list and seeing kind of what's performing best on the arena ladder. How the metagame challenges work. If you're new, it's 2,000 gold to enter. You play until you lose. If you get 7 wins, you win back like 1.5 times your gold, but most notably 30 packs of cards. If you lose your first game, you get back 500 gold. Your break even is usually about 2 wins. If you're able to achieve that, you get back basically a pack for 500 gold. So you still come out ahead in that respect. So we're going to cover a whole bunch of decks today, give you kind of a breakdown in terms of what's working. We're going to be looking at Untapped GG, what you're seeing on the screen, as well as some MTGO results curated from MTG decks. If you want to use the Untapped tracker, link is in the video description. However, all these decks I'm going to be featuring today will be included in the video description timestamp, so you could jump around and see kind of what works best. The way the weekend's kind of looking, what I will try to do is do some runs of the metagame challenge. I have an upcoming RCQ, basically in 10 days actually. It's team trios. I'm in the standard seat, so I'm going to use the metagame challenge as practice. I'm leaning towards Gruul Delirium, just based on availability of cards. But I have a backup of a Jeskai Convoke that I'm also looking at in terms of decks to kind of look in terms of the meta, but we will cover a whole bunch of stuff and kind of go from there. So looking first off at the popularity of decks. So this is basically in the last week or so, or popularity today, sorry. We'll be looking at the last week of data. The ladder did reset last night at like 3 p.m. Eastern. So the mythics are platinum, but basically for the weeks of data, we're going to be looking diamond and mythic rank since it'll include the higher kind of volume of games played, stuff like that. So Dimir Midrange is the most played deck. This could be inclusive of the new kind of this town ain't big enough bounce fear of isolation deck. So there's kind of the traditional mid with your kind of flash threats, flood pit drowners, the curiosity, stuff like that. There's Gruul Prowess in here, 9.4%. Golgari Midrange, 8%. Domain, this is the Zur Overlords deck at about 8. We have Mono Red at 7. We have the Beanstalk decks. Most of the Beanstalk decks are splashing a third color in the sideboard. We'll cover that when we go to the section. Jeskai Convoke, and then Mono White Control. Mono White still seeing play. It's relatively to the field, just not doing that well. It has a really bad Dimir matchup, and Dimir is generally going to be, I would assume, the most popular deck between that and Mono Red in this event, so I probably wouldn't bring it. Even against the decks that it should have, like theoretically it should be good against Mono Red and like the Domain decks, but I've still been beating it. They tend to kind of run out of cards, or Nemesis, you can shut off their life gain, stuff like that. Kind of looking at the ebbs and flows, we saw a slight decrease in Dimir, but it's kind of recover. We've seen Dimir pop up as high as like 25% of the metagame, similar to Mono Red. We could see likely a similar case with the beginning of the new season. We'll likely see a spike in Mono Red in the Gruul Prowess decks. Most of the Mono Red decks are adopting some amount of green. I do think like my friend's borrowing my mouse package, so I don't have a first standard. They're playing it in Pioneer. I would be playing like the Gruul Prowess. I think even if you just go the straight Mono Red main board and then have access just to the green in the sideboard for things like Paw Patch Formation or Pick Your Poison, just help a lot in terms of the Demons matchup, anything with flyers, stuff like that. But we'll look at the stats. So we're going to look December 25th, Christmas Day, to today, January 1st, 39,000 best of 3 games played, Diamond and Mythic. Highest win rate deck is actually Gruul Delirium. So this is not the exact list I'm going to be playing in RCQ, partially for twofold. So I'm not playing Ren and Realmbreaker in mine, mostly because I didn't want to buy the cards. They're $10 each for a card that I'm never going to play in any other deck. But I also don't think it's super well positioned into Dimir. Generally, Planeswalkers, if you could gum up the board, they're fine. But it is a card that's pretty weak to flyers. And Dimir's got a lot of flyers, a lot of ways to tap down your stuff, so it's not as good. The draw of Ren is it has a really nice interaction in twofold. So it's -2 mills you over. It puts cards into your hand, so that can fill your Delirium. It's a Planeswalker type if it's in the yard. The plus does allow you to animate Restless Ridgeline and get its ability without having to activate. So you can do that, put extra power with something like a Trampler or something like that, and then put through a whole bunch of damage. So this deck here, I've been saying, like, Violent Urge to me is a 1-mana Embercleave in this deck. People do not respect it, do not play around it. I've killed people out of nowhere, especially with like extra combat steps. So it gives double strike if you have Delirium, and it gives you a boost in power. So if you have something with Trample, something like Wildfire Wickerfolk, there's the Keen Eye Curator, which very easily can become a 7/7 Trampler. So you can exile cards from a graveyard. If you basically exile Delirium's worth of cards, it gets the power boost. With the Curator here, it doesn't care volume of cards. So if you exile, say, Fear of Missing Out, it counts as 2 types. Wildfire Wickerfolk is an artifact as well. Same with Patchwork Beastie, all that. So that's kind of a way around it with the deck. So you're basically trying to get extra combat steps with the Fear of Missing Out. You can haste out it with Breakout, and then Wildfire comes in as a 4/3 trample haste if you have basically Delirium in this deck. So pretty easy to get Delirium. Patchwork Beastie does some work. Synod Scout as ways to put cards into your graveyard. Some protection effects with Snakeskin Veil, and then some removal, Torch the Tower. And you'll notice Fear of Missing... Scorching Dragonfire. Another way to exile for damage, which is reasonable against the red mirrors. Even against Dimir, against like any of the Enduring Cycle, just exiling has a lot of utility there. Sideboard in this deck. So Burst Lightnings, just more cheap removal, along with Torch, Pick Your Poison, and Paw Patch as Artifact Enchantment Hate. Royal Treatment as more protection effects. You have... So I've been kind of debating if I'm just going to be playing Royal Treatment in the main over Snakeskin. So generally Royal Treatment's not played in traditional Gruul because you're playing Monstrous Rage and you can only have 1 roll token. In this particular list, it doesn't matter. So this gives just the bonus of the continual power boost with Ward. Now, it doesn't stack as well as multiple Snakeskin Veils, but having the Ward could be reasonable. Just more cheap removal. I like Pyroclasm in the deck because most of your stuff can outscale it. Really good against Convoke and the aggressive decks. Untimely Malfunction is a card that's mainly, I would say, used to get rid of blockers, and then Vengeful Possession as kind of a threat and effect. So just for comparison, this is the list I've been testing out. I do think I need to swap to have 1 more Forest in lieu of a Mountain. So I'm playing 3 Nemesis in here. I think it's reasonable in the red matchup. I'm on 3 Keen-Eyed Curators, and I'm trying out 2 Paw Patch Recruit. I've liked this against Dimir decks, decks with a lot of targeted removal. Just lets you redistribute counters. It can give you 2 bodies. It's another thing with Trample that if you can get large enough with Violent Urge can push through a lot of damage. Otherwise, my sideboard, I like the Lithomantic Barrage against the various kind of Simic decks. Just useful in that regard. Pick Your Poison, Paw Patch. Like I said, I'm going to be trying out Royal Treatment in some numbers. And then I have an Obliterating Bolt. I have Witchstalker. I think Witchstalker's easier to cast than Scorching Shot in this deck because you're playing a number of Force. I don't want a double red spell that I have to cast on 2 consistently. I like Forge still. It's not great against like Authority of the Consoles, but I still think it's reasonable. And then some Pyroclasm. So this is kind of where I'm at with the list. I could cut this, play a 4th here. I tried out an Inti, but I didn't love it because we are often Hellbent, and it was just taking your draw step and kind of looting. There wasn't ways to kind of get it back. Another card I considered, but it's not consistent enough, is Flamewake Phoenix. It's 2 mana, 2/2, could come back from your graveyard for red mana if you have Ferocious, which is creature power 4 or greater. But generally, it's only Wildfire Wickerfolk that gets to 4 power. If you're already kind of upgrading Keen Eye, you're probably winning at that point anyways. Domain Aggro. So this one here is, or not Domain Aggro, Domain Zur. So this is your Zur Overlords deck. It's using Zur to animate your various Overlords that you can cast for their impending cost and then get that attack trigger right away. So this is kind of the evolution of the Atraxa domain decks. What's interesting with this one here is we see Day of Judgment being played. We've seen Temporary Lockdown in the past, but Temporary Lockdown does hit you up the beanstalk. I think this is an interesting choice here because a lot of times players are considering I have to try to kill them by the Sunfall turn. So the earliest they could Sunfall in the deck is usually turn 4 with Overlord of the Hauntwoods. This just provides another reliable turn 4 option in terms of sweeping. So the red decks, a lot of decks can threaten turn 4 kill in terms of combat damage. This will allow you to kind of sweep up early. See a single copy of Traxa, Herd Migration, just lots of incidental ways to gain life. Analyze the Pollen early can help you hit lands, and then late game can be a tutor effect. Your sideboard, Authority of the Consuls for the red-based aggro decks. You'll sometimes see copies of like Elspeth Smite or Not on My Watch in the main board. Another options in terms of early aggression. For the mid-range mirrors, you have Doppelgang, Negate for cheap counters, Rest in Peace for Graveyard Hate, Split Up, another good removal option on 3. Again, people are usually trying to play around like other types of effects. Split Up can be pretty backbreaking. Tranquil Foil back, Artifact Enchantment, Graveyard Hate, Beza for kind of the mid-rangey matchups. Could be reasonable against aggro as well, just kind of recatching you up. You basically could buy you another turn that bridges you to one of your big drops or like a Zur turn. And then Nissa for the mid-range mirrors. Dimir Midrange, so 67%. So this is your bread and butter Kaido deck. Lots of ways to kind of cheat it in. Bunch of cheap flyers, Flood Pit Drowner, can tap down creatures, give you an unblockable. This is great to kind of rebuy with that. A lot of the decks have switched to Preacher, just good into like the aggro decks, kind of stonewalls them. A lot of the damage is 3, so main board having 4 damage could be reasonable, provides you some card advantage, some lifelink creatures if needed. Most of the decks are Flood Pit Drowners over the Bat, just more reasonable into the aggressive decks, can shuffle things away that are troublesome. Bunch cheap removal. Some folks are kind of toying around with the concept of Disfigure over Cut Down since there's so many pump spells in the format, just to kind of play around that kind of blowout. Spell Stutter is really nice because you do have your Fairy and Fairy Mastermind, but you also have Soulstone Sanctuary. There's the 3 mana, I forget the name of the card right now. 3 mana, you create 2 1/1 fairies, tap down a creature. That sees play in some of the lists as well, just as a tempo play. Plays better into the mirror, since you get multiple 1/1s that can block like Fairy Mastermind, stuff like that. It's reasonable into red decks, stuff like that. You can tap down. During Curiosity as the card advantage engine. Soulstone is a ninja and a fairy, both for Kaido and for your Fairy Matters cards. Sideboard, just cut down, disfigures, cheap removal, duress for hand hate, negates, counterspells. Nowhere to Run gets around protection effects, which is reasonable. Blot Out is really good against like your opponent's Kaidos, big stuff. Malicious Eclipse for the go wide decks. You have another Preacher for the grindier matchups. Dashana activated abilities. Shieldred, really good against aggro in the mid-range decks that are drawing a lot of cards, reasonable. Even in like these Dimir mids, a lot of times players are kind of throwing away resources. Realistically in this deck, the only answer that they have is go for the throat for it in the main. And then you have Gix Command as another sweeper effect. So Gruul Aggro. So some interesting choices here. We'll start off. So this is kind of your Innkeeper's Talent variant. Most of the talent lists are on 2 to 3. I wouldn't play 4. 4 is a little overkill in my opinion. You have basically the green cards in the main for Innkeeper's Talent and some number of Snakeskin Veil for protection. I would say you would probably trim this down to 3. You can play another Monastery Mentor, Swiftspear. I would probably just play the full set of Swiftspears. Hired Claw here or there, it sometimes gets replaced by Paw Patch Recruit. Paw Patch Recruit is trample, which is relevant by default. It pushes through, it could be multiple bodies, and then if your opponent's targeting, it's ways to kind of trigger Valiant indirectly and get some value there as well. So that's something you may want to consider in your deck as you kind of move forward. Some of them will be on Questing Druid in the main, like a 2 of, maybe a 3 of, kind of going from there. I might just, I'm going to do a little bit of digging. I think there's probably a little bit more refined list that we might want to consider. So the list that I'll paste might be slightly different, but the concept is the same of the deck. You're trying to use the mouse package to create a big double striker to just push through a whole bunch of damage on your opponent that way there. So I'll do a little bit of poking around and maybe update the list just slightly. Like I said, 4 seems to be a little bit too much in this respect. We then go to mono black demons. So a little bit of an antiquated deck, has 63%, but just tons of removal, hand hate. You're winning through like your Unholy Annex, Archfiend stuff. With the uptick in volume of Dimir decks, Fairy Mastermind plays very nicely into Annex, which is bad for you because you're basically giving your opponent a draw every turn. One thing too with this mana base, they're playing 7 colorless lands with a tapped Citadel. Can be a bit problematic when you are trying to cast double black. So that's something to just be mindful of. I think you're probably 1 land too many, 2 lands too many in terms of colorless. So maybe trim like a Fountain Port and a Soulstone in that respect, just to kind of ease up those numbers, just to make it a little bit easier to actually cast your spells. But just mid-range pile doing its mid-range things. Cut downs, Dreams of Steel and Oil. So just cheap removal, hand hate, cheap removal, graveyard hate with the Ghost Vacuum, Filigree Salix, kind of Ratchet Bomb-esque effect where you can hit like enchantments, stuff like that. Artifacts out of your opponent's deck. So like Forge, for example. Withering Torment can hit enchantments. Blot Out, like we mentioned. And then just a bunch of kind of mid-range grind cards. Mono red aggro. So stock mono red deck. Nothing really innovative here. Very aggressive. Similar to the Gruul, just a little bit more refined. You have, the, like in terms of the mana base, Rockface Village with all your pump effects in terms of Manifold Mouse, Emberheart Challenger, Heartfire Hero. The Gruul deck can output more sheer damage with things like the Talent and then protection effects, and then has some card advantage with what's its name? Questing Druid. So that provides some utility there. Mono red gets like Rockface. It also gets a little bit more removal in the main with Lightning Strike, which can help against things like Glissa or any of the 3 mana threats. Torch Tower is cheap removal. I do like some number of, like Torch is very strong in like mono red mirrors. Scorching Dragonfire as a 1/of, like a 3/1 split could be reasonable. Lithomantic Barrage may be something you want to consider, because the thing is you don't have many ways to sack for bargain in this deck. You don't make a lot of tokens. So this is basically a 1 mana 2 damage spell. Lithomantic Barrage is reasonable against the Terror decks, stuff like that. Just having a cheap 1 mana answer to get rid of their stuff. Also hits like Beza, for example. Twisted Fealty is like a threaten effect. Obliterating Bolt, cheap removal. Sunspine for the greedier mana-based decks, another way to turn off life gain. And then Urbrass Forge. So like against Dimir, Screaming Nemesis isn't consistent enough. They have a lot of cheap removal for it. This dodges most of their removal other than the cut down. It can attack into most of their threats, and then it just deals damage on TB. I still like Forge a lot. Rakdos mid. So probably a little bit more leaning on the mid meme side, but small sample, doing okay. This one here is the Harmless Offering Demonic Pact deck. So basically donating it to your opponent, and then they lose the game with the trigger on the stack. You have a sack package, so Disturbing Mirth will sack some of your other enchantments. So this one's going more enchantment based as opposed to creature based. So this can sack like the token from Case or the Case itself. Nowhere to Run, Hopeless Nightmare, any of those effects there. Lily's in here, just a bunch of removal. Brother Beseech helps you find your pieces for the combo. Sideboard, just like Hand Hate, Graveyard Hate, some sweepers, Lily for the grindy matchups. Render Inert is basically here if your opponent's on Archfiend to draw, so you just get them that way. Urbrass Forge, if your opponent's generally going to take out some removal for the mid-range matchups, just gives you kind of a sticky threat. Some removal, and then some threats for the mid-range matchups in Shieldred and Aclazotz. Boros Mice, so another kind of adaptation on the mouse package. So you still have your mouse package. With the white cards, you get access to Mabel, Heir of Craigflame. So 3 mana 3/3 Lord for your mice. That gives you a equipment that gives you a whole bunch of things. +1/1, Vigilance, Trample, Haste for a relatively low equip cost of 2. That triggers Valiant as well for your mice. You have a couple of Flowerfoot Swordmasters, and then you get access to Lightning Helix, Sheltered by Ghost as removal, plays really nicely with the Double Strikers, and Shard Mage Rescue for protection. You have cheap removal. White gives you access to basically effects that the red decks don't have. So Destroy Evil will destroy big things as well as enchantments. You have Exercise, another Sheltered, really good in the aggro mirrors. Screaming Nemesis for the aggro mirrors. For the more control-ish matchups, mid-range matchups, you have Forge, and then Witch Stalker as catch-all removal, like for 5 damage. Interesting one here, Jeskai Oculus. So we've had blue-white Oculus decks. This one is kind of a take on the Oculus pile. So you're still kind of drawing, discarding to try to get back your Oculus with Helping Hand or Recommission, but you have Fear of Missing Out as a looter. You have Steamcore Scholar that gets, so draws discard, so you get some value there. Then if you discard 2 cards, unless you discard an instant sorcery or creature with flying. So it's basically just could become a big threat in that regard. If you just get like extra combat steps, since it has the vigilance, works nicely there. Cheap removal, some bounce, you have protection effects. Sometimes like Prof Dedetic's Memory might be reasonable in this deck as a one-of. That usually seems to see some play with Steamcore Scholar. That's where my mind was going. But Malcolm is a cheap effect. Just lots of ways to kind of draw a discard to get your Oculus. So less all in on a singular threat and just a lot of velocity in terms of drawing discard. Even instead of Steamcore Scholar, you could probably play Kiora. So not evasive, but Kiora threatens to have a large body behind it once you hit threshold. You have Graveyard Hate, counters for big stuff, Exercise, Catch-all removal, Get Lost, some more negates, Sheltered for the aggressive matchups, Kaido for the grindier matchups, and then Forge again for heavy removal base decks. We're gonna keep going. Jeskai Convoke. So I've had a lot of frustration with Convoke. I've lost to the mana base more than I've lost to anything else. I find it a bit frustrating. Just you're like a lot of pain lands against aggro, or just drawing 2 lands or no lands. You kind of you don't find like what you need as consistent. You could have really strong decks, but the deck's very polarizing. This list, I'm gonna find a better list because I'll explain the deck, but don't play Arabella, play full Warden. So some of these lists, like people are doing all right, but there's no reason the Convoke deck should not be on 4 Warden. It's like the best card, one of the best cards in the deck, helps smooth out the draws. But kind of make that change at the minimum. I'll share the list like I've been trying it. There's a few different variants. So the kind of the flex spots with the deck are the core of the deck. Let's start off with that. Make creature with cheap artifact, Gleeful Demolition, Knight Errant, get value. You have things like Warden of the Inner Sky that can tap stuff, get you a Vigilant Body that's flying, smooth out your draws. This with Sheltered is really strong because you can do offense, defense. So a couple of things. While Shelter can be strong at times, a lot of your creatures are very weak. So they're like 1-2 toughness. So you can't really attack it at times. So like the Evasive Body works nice, but it's not like super consistent in that regard. Tried varied numbers of Mockingbirds. What I found with it was there's times it's really good, but if it's in your opener, a lot of times it's just a 1 mana. I might go back to it because I found like it could copy your opponent's stuff at times. Could give you an Evasive Body against the tokens deck, which isn't too bad. And then at least it works with Sheltered, so that's one thing. I've tried like splits between Case, Sheltered by Ghost, as well as Painter Studio as a way to have an Anthem effect that's not based on contingent on having creatures attack. It's also card advantage. So those are kind of some of the considerations with the deck. Cheap removal, Destroy Evil, you got your counter package, and Rest in Peace for Graveyard Hate. Forge is something you might want to consider. Just kind of options in that respect. But I think I went like 3-3 with it. If I'm not mistaken. I went 2-4 or 3-3. 2-4. I punted a game. I should have attacked also. It realistically was 3-3 if I didn't make like a big blunder. But like I was trying out Unicorn as well. I liked it as just a bigger body. Split Up's good in the mirror. So this is kind of the configuration I was looking at. Soul Partition's good against the red decks. Just buys you some time, exiles them. So this is kind of the idea of where I was at with the list. I was trying out different numbers. Like I had the Painter Studio main. I didn't have the main. I had them in the side. I had Cases. I didn't have Cases. Case I found very polarizing. Just at times just didn't do anything. So Beanstalk deck, 60%. So a lot of these decks are splashing a third color, like I mentioned. This one's black. I've seen ones with white that play white for Sheltered by Ghosts in the sideboard. You can also have like various Destroy Evil style effects if needed. Core of the deck is your kind of drawing, discarding, bouncing, putting cheap cards into your graveyard so you get a reduced cost Eddy Mark Crab or Tolarian Terror. These then allow you to draw cards off the Beanstalk. This town ain't big enough could be used to reset your creatures or your opponents. Very strong with Storm Chaser's Talent. This engine, Storm Chaser's Talent plus this town ain't big enough, is a way to kind of keep rebuying value. Your Storm Chaser could buy your this town then resets your Storm Chaser, which rebuys it, and you kind of go to town from there. The black gives you access to Nowhere to Run. It gives you access to Terra Sunder's ability. You'll see a swamp in the sideboard, so if you're bringing these cards in, bring in the swamp because you have stuff like Bushwhack that can help you find the land. Ghost Vacuum, cheap graveyard hate. Mental Misstep for like the red-based aggro decks. Some Pick Your Poison, Paw Patch. I honestly like Paw Patch more than Pick Your Poison just because it's targeted. This does give you access to Artifact Hate, so against Forge decks it could be reasonable, but you also then just have access to like Terra Sunder if needed. Herbology Instructor for the aggressive decks, you can keep bouncing it and gain life that way there. And then negates for cheap counters. Izzet Hellraiser, 60%, so this is another kind of graveyard combo deck. Another deck that's looking to draw and discard cards, just a lot of rummaging style effects. And what you want is 9 cards in your graveyard, and then the Capricious Hellraiser only costs 3. It enters, you randomly exile 3 cards from your graveyard, you choose a non-creature, non-land from them, and you get to copy it. So ideally what you want to copy is things like Season of Weaving that makes more copies of your Hellraiser, and you kind of go Splinter Twinny. Chandras are good hits. You have like the Roaring Furnace style effects. If you have Bitter Reunion out, you can give haste to your team that turn, which is strong. Sweepers and Ill Time as some of the considerations there. You do want to be mindful of what you're putting in the graveyard. The natural inclination is you're going to start bidding extra lands, but the more lands you have in your graveyard initially, the higher likelihood that you hit just lands, and then it kind of fizzles the Hellraiser. But a little bit of a lottery deck. So Ghost Vacuum, Graveyard Hate, Barrage, cheap removal, Soul Guide. So this is kind of one-off hits. This is nuke the whole graveyard. Cheap removal with a Braid, Pyroclasma Sweepers with Brotherhoods, Scorching Dragonfires, cheap removal, negate cheap counters, Tishana's for activated abilities, Jace for kind of the mid-range mirrors. You just mill them out, especially if your opponent's attacking your graveyard. And then Virtue and Knowledge could double up the activated abilities of like Jace. So you could like mill 30, for example. You could deal a whole bunch of damage with Chandra. You could get double Hellraiser triggers, stuff of that nature there. When I was playing this deck, I kind of wanted another threat outpost board. So whether it be a Jace, even just like a Forge for kind of the grindier matchups. So another deck that you'll be seeing probably some bit, and this one here is from Elf Kicker, who's Meowdic on Twitch, a very good player. They're 43-13, but they're typically like top 10 mythic. So this is kind of an evolution of, which we'll cover in a sec, the Esper Pixie list. But again, this combination of Storm Chaser's Talent plus this town ain't big enough as a way to bounce and rebuy. This version here has got Entity Tracker that can draw you cards, another Flash Threat. So a lot of kind of flash elements with the deck. Fear of Isolation has a clause that you can't play it unless you return a spell to your hand or a permanent to your hand for a 2/3 body. But this is nice because you do want to. So things like Nowhere to Run, Storm Chasers, Tiny Bones, Hopeless Nightmare, all ways to kind of reset. You can then use Kaido to get this back to hand, to reset your removal, stuff like that. Get Out is a counter spell, but also can just return creatures or enchantments to your hand, so you kind of rebuy. Sporadic Infection enters, target player sacrifices a creature other than enchanted. When enchanted creatures dealt damage, destroy it. So another kind of these edict effects that are stapled to an enchantment. Cheap removal, Hand Hate, Graveyard Hate. Tithing Blade is another edict effect. Negate for counters. Blot Out for big stuff. Tishana for activate abilities. Shieldred for the mid-range players. Then looking at it, we have the Pixie list. This one went 5-0 in an MTGO league. So similar concepts, but you have Optimistic Scavenger that puts counters on things, as well as Nurturing Pixie. The Pixie itself will kind of reset, similar to Fear of Isolation. So it's just a lot of ways to kind of bounce these effects. Spiteful Hexmage, you can just bounce the Curse token, for example. Tithing Blade as Edict. Hopeless Nightmare, Nowhere to Run is cheap removal. Sheltered is a way to reset. Storm Chaser's Talent, again, just kind of rebuying these effects. White, mana base is a bit worse, but gives you access to white cards. So Shrouded Shepherd as an Edict effect. Sheltered by Ghost again for the aggro matchups. Get life linkers. Rest in Peace for Graveyard Hate. No More Lies, cheap counter. Meticulous Excavation, another way to bounce stuff to your hand. Get out, and then Destroy Evil for bigger. We have the Otters deck. So this one from Jataxian 11 went 5-0 in MTGO League. So this deck here is using Enduring Vitality and Valley Floodcaller to untap your creatures for mana. When you, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, they get like Prowess boost, and then you generate a whole bunch of mana. Torch Tower, again, this town with the Storm Chaser's Talent combo. Just a bunch of cheap effects, so you're just drawing, discarding, and then generating a whole bunch of mana and eventually killing them that way there. Similarly, we have Braid for Graveyard Hate. Basilisk Collar is an interesting one. Just we've seen at times the tools for the 5 mana, like you get a manifest, but they have to sack to re-equip. This is another way to just give lifelink to one of your creatures. Song of Tokuzan can generate a whole bunch of creatures out of nowhere with haste. Negate for cheap counters. Litho for like the blue-white matchups. Pyroclasm for the aggressive decks. Ral, another way to have like a grindier option. Paw Patch, Screaming Nemesis for the red-based aggro. Ghost Vacuum for Graveyard Hate. So various cage decks. So this is built around Selesnya Cage. This went from PC Polaris 5-0 on MTGO. So it's built around the card Collector's Cage. So Hideaway, basically look at a number of cards from the top of your library, 5, put one face down, and then you, for mana, you put a counter on target creature. Control creatures with power 3 different powers. Get to cast a card for free. So your kind of big hit off the card is the Overlord of the Mistmoors. This particular version is interesting. It's only playing 1 Enduring Innocence. Usually you'd see upwards of 3 to 4. Instead, they're playing some Regal Caracals instead. So you may want to kind of consider that as kind of a swap. Another big scorecard here, Sandstorm Salvager. Makes 2 bodies, and then you can put counters and gives things trample. Llanowar Elves help you get ahead to your 3 drops. Sanguine Evangelist, multiple bodies with Battle Cry. Paw Patch, multiple bodies. The Offspring ability is really useful. And then Sky Knight Squire just gives you the more counters that go on it when more creatures come in, gives you an evasive body, plays really nicely with Sheltered. Bunnicorn is another card I've seen in some of these lists, so it's kind of how you want to assemble your creature package. Soul Partition, Virtue of Loyalty as some more spells. Sideboard, Destroy Evils, Elspeth Smite for cheap removal, Invasion for Goboken as Hand Hate, Aven Interrupter is kind of a counter spell, Rest in Peace for Graveyard Hate, Sheltered by Ghost, just more for the red-based decks, and Unidentified Hovership is a creature, it's a removal spell that can also be another creature that works with Collector's Cage. And then lastly, Misplaced Ginger won the weekend standard challenge with Golgari. So Golgari Midrange, some interesting choices here. We see 2 Thrun in the main board as a card into the Dimir deck. So can't be countered, and then can't be the target of non-green spells your opponent controls, and has indestructible during your turn. So a lot of text that makes Dimir sad. So can attack in, even if it gets blocked, it's indestructible. So it can attack into a Shield Druid or whatever it may be. I have 3 Shield Druids, Preachers, Mosswood, so no Annex in this version, just kind of creature heavier version. Anoint, Cut Down, Tear Asunder, Copy of the End, Go for the Throat. Maelstrom Pulse is a 2 of, just kind of for the go wide. Gix Command main as a sweeper. So this version here is on full Mishra's Foundry over Soulstone, which is an interesting inclusion here. Hand Hate with Duress, Ghost Vacuum for Graveyard Hate, full set of Harvester of Miseries for the Convoke Go Wide decks. Anything that's like spewing the board, honestly, even pretty reasonable against Dimir. There's a lot of X1s in the deck, so cleans that up. Nissa for the mid-rangey matchups, nowhere to run cheap removal that gets around protection. Tear Asunder, flexible removal, another Copy of the End, and then Tranquil Frillback, Artifact, Enchantment Hate, stuff like that. So that was a lot of decks, 35 minutes. So good luck in the Metagame Challenge. If you hit 7 wins, make sure to drop your list, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching.